So, one of my most favorite economists of all time was Milton Friedman. He was a Nobel Prize winner in economics. He was a world-renowned economist, and he even served under the Reagan administration as an economic advisor to President Reagan. And one of my most favorite quotes from the man was this one. He said, "Government policies should not be judged by their intent, but rather by the outcomes they produce." And this was one of the most important quotes for me, changing my views on economics. I used to be a socialist, and I always judged policies based on their intent, like free healthcare, free college, welfare. I always thought that it didn't matter of the effects, it mattered why they were being instituted in the first place. And I never really cared or looked at the effects of programs like welfare. So for this episode, we're going to be focusing on welfare and the harmful effects of welfare. So as you can see, this is a chart here provided by the Illinois Policy Institute. And the Illinois Policy Institute conducted a study on what they called the welfare cliff. And what they said the welfare cliff was a huge drop in income as pay increases because, of course, if you get paid more, then you'll qualify for less and less programs under welfare. So the highest amount of welfare programs, and they used a single mother living in Chicago as an example, is this brown and yellow line. They peak at around the same spot, so we'll use those as an example. So what is really interesting is this huge gap in the median pay between this yellow line right here, which is accounting for all of these benefits, and this teal line right here, which is a linear line showing a progression as a worker climbs the ladder. At no point until over $38 does this worker on the teal line make as much as this worker here, and he's working at $8.25 an hour. He's working at $38 an hour. So there's absolutely no incentive for this person to work past $12 an hour. As you can see, after he starts making more than $12 an hour, his pay considerably drops. It goes from $60,000 all the way to $35,000, right? So that's like a $25,000 loss in his income simply for wanting to work from $12 an hour to $18 an hour. And what this does is it basically hurts work incentives. If I'm working at $8.25 an hour and I actually start losing money by working more, then I'll simply stay at this level, $8.25 per hour, and I'll never want to better my economic opportunity. So this is one of the conclusions the Illinois Policy Institute reached, was that this is another way that welfare keeps people in a cycle of poverty. They never want to achieve better incomes because those better incomes will mean less money. Another argument made by people is if there wasn't welfare, then everybody would simply be poor. There would be a lot of poverty, and there would just be huge amounts of misery. The War on Poverty, which was instituted in the 1960s, it introduced welfare. That has slowed down or decreased poverty tremendously. But that simply isn't the case. So as you can see, this is an analysis between the relationship between welfare spending and the poverty rate. So as you can see, the red line, the welfare spending, is slightly increasing until 1964. And at this point, the welfare expenditures explode, and it has been exploding ever since. So you would assume if welfare is the way to get individuals out of poverty, that the poverty rate, they would have an inverse relationship. As welfare spending climbs drastically, poverty will reduce drastically. But that simply hasn't been the case. So we see this large decrease in the percentage of those in poverty. And then the war on poverty starts, we see a slight decrease, and that can be explained because as individuals progress throughout American history, the poverty rate has always been decreasing. So this decrease isn't something that should come as a surprise. But what should come as a surprise is that right around 1970, the poverty rate basically levels out. We see some instances of decrease, increase, increase, decrease, and then a slight increase. So poverty hasn't been going down, even though we've been spending nearly $1 trillion on welfare expenditures just last year. The poverty rate hasn't really seen such a significant downturn. Now, why is this? Why is welfare not effective at bringing people out of poverty? Well, that's very simple. Welfare, instituted by the government, is terribly inefficient. So this is a graph from David Longstreet of the Cato Institute, and he wanted to see how inefficient welfare is. So the left bar is the government welfare, and the right bar is private charities. So you would probably think, well, when I have to pay $1 to the government for welfare, they're probably going to use 80% or 90% on the actual welfare recipient. But no, 70% of government entitlement funds go towards administrational costs, and only 30% goes towards the actual recipient. Now, compare this on charities. So charities, they spend 82% on the recipient of the charity, and only 10% on administrational costs. You would even think that because private charities have to spend a somewhat more money than governments on fundraising, the government doesn't really need to do fundraising, but charities do. But charities only spend 8% on fundraising. So 18% of the money going towards charities are going towards things not associated to the recipient. They're going towards administrational costs and fundraising, but 82% is still going towards the recipient. And that's 52% more than government entitlement programs. So if you looked at this, you would say, wow, that's extremely terrible. And you would be right, because the National Charity Database, if I can find it here, the Charity Navigator, which assigns rankings from 0 to 5 on efficiency of charities, the government would receive a 0. So some on the left tend to say, well, we are very stingy welfare users in America because we don't really like the poor. We spend very little of our money on welfare. But again, that's not true. While there are definitely countries that spend a lot more than the United States, there are several that spend lower. Australia is a good example. Ireland is a good example. Even Canada, which has free college and free healthcare, they have less money they spend less of their money or their GDP on entitlements. Another good example would be Israel or Chile, Mexico, Korea. These are all examples of countries that are modernized, that are good countries, but they don't spend as much on entitlement programs. And you might say, well, what about history? So in 1996, if you didn't know, Bill Clinton passed welfare reform, and welfare reform basically threw millions of Americans out of welfare. The whole point of the welfare reform was to lower the budget on welfare, to kick more people out of welfare, and to incentivize people to get jobs. And you would think that with this program, we would see higher rates of poverty if welfare was indeed helping those people. But no. As you can see, we see a subtle decrease in poverty thanks to welfare, people would assume. But then after 1996, this decrease actually continues, and it's actually even steeper. You would think that the poverty rate would stay leveled out or even increase with this new welfare reform, but it actually substantially decreases. So the main gist of what I'm getting at, and I'll be concluding this video with this final message, don't assume policies are good based on why they are instituted. Always look at the effects they are having on the recipient of the programs. So, thank you for watching. Catch you next time.